Hello, in this video series we'll show you some of the power of the Enterprise Vault DTrace utility. In this video we'll take a look at the DTrace file that we generated in the second video. It was a trace file of archiving a single test mailbox in our test environment. It's good practice to trace to a specific folder and use good file names when generating your trace files. You might want to set up a folder specifically for trace files off your main system disks. The trace files, as we've seen and we'll see in further videos, can get very big very quickly. Over here in the Vault admin console, we can right-click on the trace that we previously had and go to the properties, and we can see the folder where the file was created, and we can see the file name. When we're looking at the folder, it's worth remembering the rollover settings which were set as part of the original setup. By default, DTrace rolls over to a new file when the file gets to 100 meg. It used to be that the trace files would just get simply too big to handle. It's pretty daunting and hard to handle a multi-gigabyte file. In this example, we see a reasonable sized trace file for our test that we performed in our first video. Before we move on though, here is a screenshot of a folder that contains some trace that I did on a different system the other day. See how the files have rolled over to new ones when the threshold of 100 meg has been reached? You might end up with many of these files depending on what you are tracing and depending on how long you're tracing for. When opening the trace file for the first time, the first two things I normally look at are the header and the registry information at the bottom. Let's quickly see those in the example trace. The header has some useful information in it, such as the date and the time that the file was created, how long the DTrace was running for, and the title and description that we gave when we were setting up the DTrace. The bottom of the trace file has a list of registry settings currently deployed and file version information. Here's the file version information. As we can see here, this is 10.0.3. If we go up a little way, we'll see the registry information that's deployed on this Enterprise Vault server. The next thing to look at is the middle of the trace file. At this point, we only need to check that we've actually got something. It's all too easy to capture the wrong processes, or to capture processes that we think are the correct ones, but in fact aren't involved in the operation that we're trying to trace. Here we can see for our archiving run, we've got archive task, agent client broker, and a few other processes. If we jump back right to the top of the trace, here's a list of the processes that trace file captured for us. Remember, this is one of the predefined trace files, and in a future video we'll come back and see how we can adjust these. Over here now we see a screenshot of what I would term a bad capture. I've got a header and a footer with registry and file version information, but in the middle I have nothing. Avoid sending these types of files to support, they'll get cross. Other things that we look for in the middle of the trace are the process names, as we just discussed, threads that we can see performing functions within the task, check things like the date and the time of the entries in the trace file, and also look for buffer overflows. These are usually recorded when DTrace is trying to capture too much information and just can't keep up. It's also common to see buffer overflows if you run DTrace from a command prompt, set it up to log to a file, and then type MON so that you can see the trace on the screen at the same time. This often leads to buffer overflows. Usually when you run the trace from the VAC, you won't see any buffer overflows. Finally, we then start searching the trace file for clues relating to our problem. This is part art and part science. Obviously, if you're investigating a particular event ID that you see in the event log, then it's worth looking for that. And searching for things like ~E will help you with that. Note, searching for error numbers can sometimes yield the wrong results, as we'll see here. I'm searching for the event ID 6759, but you see it'll jump to things like line numbers, process IDs and thread IDs. It can be a pain when doing that, so please remember to try to use ~E for errors. Searching for error is another common place to start, but remember that some errors are reported as errors in the trace, but are actually just fine. Another common thing to search for is exception, but again, sometimes exceptions are normal. What to search for comes with experience, but the main thing is to step through things, search, mark lines of interest, and keep on digging. It's why it's important to have a good text editor, as we'll see on the next slide. It's essential to have a good large file text editor. Many people have their own preferences. I've listed a couple of decent ones on this slide. Notepad++ is quite powerful, and that's what we'll see in further videos. It could be quite detrimental to the EV server if you try to open a several hundred meg file in Notepad. You'll see massive spikes in CPU and disk activity. These and other issues, large file text editors handle them much better, essentially opening a window onto the file rather than the whole file. In summary then, when we begin to look at DTrace, we need to locate the trace file or the trace files, because don't forget these files may have rolled over. An initial review is just to look at the header and the footer, and then scan through the middle section to make sure that you have got some data captured. Keyword searching is what we then try and do to try and pick our way through the trace file and try and track processes, threads and parts of the task. It's very important to have a good large file text editor. Even if you copied the file off your EV server and try and open it on a desktop machine, a several hundred meg text file will simply kill the machine that you're trying to work on. I hope that showing you how to look at a DTrace file is useful. Thank you. Goodbye.